The August heat in Macon, Georgia, was a physical presence, a suffocating blanket that clung to the skin and made the air thick with the smell of asphalt and exhaust. Inside Peachy's Chicken Shack, a 24/7 beacon of fried food off the I-75, the overworked air conditioning was losing its battle. The air was heavy with the scent of sizzling grease, buttermilk biscuits, and something else. The low, simmering frustration of a dinner rush crowd. Kyle, a lanky college kid with acne dotting his forehead, was trying his best to ignore it. His job was to mop the floors and clean the bathrooms, and right now, his biggest problem was the silver-handled door to the handicapped restroom. It had been locked for the better part of an hour. At first, it was just an annoyance. A customer would jiggle the handle, grunt, and then get in the longer line for the men's room. But as minutes stretched into a half hour, then 45, the annoyance curdled into suspicion. The dinner line snaked out the door, and a growing number of patrons were now glaring at the stubbornly closed restroom. A large man in a trucker hat banged his fist on the door. "Hey, you alive in there? Some of us gotta go." Silence was the only reply. Kyle's manager, a tired-looking woman named Brenda, finally waddled over, a ring of keys jangling from her belt. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, her patience worn thin. "I swear, if it's kids messing around again..." She selected a master key and inserted it into the lock. The click was unnervingly loud in the sudden hush that had fallen over that corner of the restaurant. Brenda pushed the door open, and the scream that tore from her throat was raw and primal. It silenced the sizzle of the fryers and the chatter of the customers. Kyle, standing behind her, peered over her shoulder, and the greasy scent of fried chicken was instantly replaced by the coppery metallic stench of blood. The sight that met his eyes would be seared into his memory, playing on a loop in his nightmares for years to come. Sprawled on the grimy tile floor were two bodies, lying in separate glistening pools of dark crimson that were slowly merging into one. A black woman, her casual blouse soaked and stained, was slumped against the wall, her throat cut in a grotesque, gaping smile. Her eyes were wide open, fixed on the ceiling, with an expression of permanent, horrified surprise. A few feet away lay an older black man, his crisp polo shirt shredded and punctured by a dozen or more stab wounds to his chest and abdomen. His arms were raised in a final, futile attempt to defend himself, his hands frozen in a claw-like gesture. The sheer violence was breathtaking. Blood spattered the walls, the toilet, even the baby-changing station mounted on the wall. It was a scene of pure, unadulterated rage. Brenda stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth as she gagged. Kyle, his face the color of chalk, fumbled for his phone, his fingers shaking so badly he could barely dial 911. Detective Elijah Eli Ford felt the familiar weight of exhaustion settle on his shoulders as he guided his unmarked Ford Crown Victoria into the chaotic parking lot of Peachy's Chicken Shack. The setting sun cast long, dramatic shadows, painting the scene in hues of orange and blood red. Flashing red and blue lights strobed across the garish, cartoonish chicken logo on the restaurant's sign, a surreal juxtaposition of fast food cheerfulness and brutal death. At 58, with only 6 months left until retirement, Eli had seen more than his share of what people were capable of doing to one another. He thought he was past being surprised, but a double homicide in a fast food bathroom was a new one, even for him. His partner, Detective Jake Walsh, sat in the passenger seat, his youthful face a mixture of grim determination and barely concealed excitement. Walsh was 10 years on the force, but only 2 in homicide, and he still carried the eager energy of a man who believed he could fix the world, one case at a time. Eli, on the other hand, just hoped to close this one out without it giving him a heart attack. "Hell of a place for a curtain call," Walsh muttered, looking at the swarm of uniforms and the yellow tape cordoning off the building. "Death doesn't check the Zagat rating," Eli grumbled, killing the engine. He took a moment, his gaze sweeping over the scene. The gawkers were already gathering, their faces illuminated by the flashing lights, hungry for a glimpse of the tragedy. He hated this part, the public spectacle of private grief. As they got out of the car, a young patrolman with a buzz cut met them at the tape. "Evening, Detective Ford. It's a mess in there," he said, his voice tight. "2 victims, male and female, both African-American. Looks like a deal gone bad, maybe. Found a couple 20s on the floor near the bodies." Eli's eyes narrowed slightly. It was the default assumption, the easy narrative he'd heard 1,000 times over his 30-year career when the victims were black. drugs, gangs, money. It was a tidy box to put the chaos in, a way to dismiss the victims as participants in their own demise. He didn't say anything, just gave a curt nod and pulled on a pair of latex gloves. "Let's see what we've actually got, shall we?" he said, his voice a low rumble. He ducked under the tape, Walsh right behind him. The air inside the restaurant was cold and sterile, scrubbed clean of the earlier chaos, but still thick with an unspoken horror. As Eli approached the restroom at the end of the hall, he steeled himself. He knew from long experience that the assumptions you carry into a crime scene are the heaviest and most dangerous things of all. This wasn't a drug deal. He could feel it in his gut. The sheer intimate rage of it all felt deeply, terrifyingly personal. The medical examiner, Dr. Anya Sharma, looked up as Eli and Walsh entered the cramped, blood-soaked bathroom. The forensics team moved around them with practiced, almost balletic grace, their cameras flashing, dusting for prints on every conceivable surface. The air was thick with the chemical smell of luminol and the lingering scent of iron. "Eli," Dr. Sharma said, her voice clinical but tinged with weariness. "This was a frenzy. The man, he put up a fight. Defensive wounds all over his hands and forearms. I'm counting at least 15 stab wounds to the torso. One went straight through the heart. He died fast, but not before he knew what was happening." She gestured with a gloved hand toward the woman. She was the primary target, I think. The slit throat is deep, almost a decapitation. The work of pure rage. She has a few wounds to the abdomen as well, but that throat wound, that was the message. "Time of death?" Eli asked, his eyes scanning every detail of the horrific tableau. "Body temp and lividity suggest sometime between 6:30 and 7:30 p.m., right in the middle of their dinner rush." Walsh found a purse tucked behind the toilet, miraculously untouched by the blood. He carefully opened it with a pen, revealing a driver's license. "Got an ID, Simone Hayes, age 29. He then pointed to the male victim. Patrol found a wallet on him, Reginald Hayes, 52. Eli looked from one victim to the other. Hayes, the same last name. "Husband and wife?" he mused aloud. "Big age gap," Walsh noted. "But possible." Dr. Sharma cleared her throat. "Simone Hayes is wearing a wedding ring. Reginald is not." The pieces clicked into place with a grim, unsettling logic. "Check their relationship," Eli ordered Walsh. "He could be her father-in-law." It was a sickening thought, a possibility that made the scene even more disturbing. A secret, sordid rendezvous in a public bathroom that had ended in a bloodbath. As Walsh stepped out to run the names, Eli felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This case was already spiraling into something dark and tangled. A few minutes later, Walsh returned, his face pale. "You were right, Eli. Simone Hayes is married to a Darius Hayes. Reginald is Darius's father. She was his daughter-in-law." The confirmation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. The motive was starting to take shape, and it was as old as time itself. Jealousy and betrayal. Now they had the unenviable task of informing a man that he had lost his wife and his father in the same night, found together in the most compromising of circumstances. Darius Hayes lived in a small but tidy craftsman-style house in a quiet, working-class neighborhood on the south side of Macon. A well-maintained 20-year-old Toyota pickup truck was parked in the driveway. The lawn was neatly trimmed, and a child's bicycle lay on its side near the front porch. It was a picture of modest, domestic tranquility, a world away from the carnage at Peachy's Chicken Shack. Eli knocked on the door, the sound echoing in the humid night air. He hated this part of the job more than anything. He was the messenger of doom, the man who shattered lives with a few carefully chosen, inadequate words. The door opened, and a man stood before them. He was in his early 30s with a strong build and hands calloused from physical labor. His face, etched with confusion at the sight of two detectives on his doorstep at 10 o'clock at night, was a mirror image of the dead woman's. It was Darius Hayes. "Mr. Hayes?" Eli began, his voice gentle. "I'm Detective Ford, and this is Detective Walsh, Macon PD. May we come in?" Darius's confusion morphed into alarm. "Is everything all right? Did something happen to Simone?" He stepped aside, letting them into a small, cozy living room filled with family photos. In almost every picture, he and Simone were smiling, their arms wrapped around each other. "Mr. Hayes," Eli said, getting straight to the point. There was no easy way to do this. There's been an incident. I'm very sorry to have to tell you this, but your wife, Simone, she's passed away." The reaction was immediate and visceral. Darius's face crumpled as if he'd been physically struck. His legs seemed to give way and he stumbled back onto the couch, his head in his hands. A raw, guttural sob escaped his lips. No, that's not possible. She just went out to meet a friend for dinner. She was supposed to be home an hour ago." "No." Walsh looked at Eli, his expression filled with sympathy. The grief seemed utterly heartbreakingly real. Eli let him have a moment before delivering the second blow. "I'm afraid that's not all, sir. Your father, Reginald Hayes, he was found with her. He has also passed away." Darius looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief and horror, tears streaming down his face. My father with Simone? What happened? Was it a car accident? A robbery?" "We're still investigating, Mr. Hayes," Eli said, watching him closely. "Can you tell us where you were tonight, say, between 6 and 8 p.m.? "Me?" Darius asked, his voice choked with sobs. "I was at work. I'm a mechanic at Deacon's Auto Repair. We had a rush job on an old Chevy, a transmission rebuild. I was there until well after 9. Deacon, my boss, he was with me the whole time. You can ask him. Oh God, my wife, my father." He broke down again, his body shaking with uncontrollable grief. They stayed for a few more minutes, asking gentle questions that Darius answered through his tears. He seemed completely shattered, a man whose entire world had just been obliterated. As they walked back to their car, leaving the sounds of his weeping behind them, Walsh shook his head. Poor bastard. Loses his wife and his dad in one night. And his alibi sounds rock solid. We're back to square one. Maybe that patrolman was right. A robbery gone wrong. Eli didn't answer right away. He slid into the driver's seat. The image of Darius Hayes' grief-stricken face burned into his mind. It had been a powerful performance. Almost too powerful. 30 years of watching people lie, cry, and confess had honed his instincts into a razor's edge. And right now, something about Darius Hayes' perfect, all-encompassing sorrow felt just a little bit off. It felt rehearsed. The next morning, the investigation began to branch out, sending tendrils into the lives of Simone and Reginald Hayes. Eli knew that victims were never just names on a report. They were people with histories, secrets, and relationships that could hold the key to their own demise. He sent Walsh to interview Simone's colleagues at the boutique where she worked as a manager, while he decided to pay a visit to the one person who might be able to shed some light on the patriarch of the Hayes family, Reginald's sister. Martha Hayes lived in a small, immaculately kept apartment on the other side of town. She was a thin, bird-like woman with weary eyes that had seen too much. When Eli told her about her brother, she didn't cry. She just sat down heavily in her armchair and stared at the floral pattern on the carpet, her face a mask of resigned sorrow. "I can't say I'm surprised," she said finally, her voice raspy. "Not that it ended like this, but that it ended in violence. My brother, Reginald, walked through life like he owned it, and everyone in it." "What do you mean by that, Ms. Hayes?" Eli asked gently, his pen poised over his notebook. A bitter smile touched her lips. "Reginald was a good Christian man to the outside world, a deacon at the church, always the first to donate, always with a kind word. But at home, he was a tyrant. Especially with Darius." She took a shaky breath. "He controlled every aspect of that boy's life. What he wore, who his friends were, what he studied. When Darius said he wanted to be a mechanic instead of a lawyer, Reginald nearly disowned him. He saw Darius not as a son, but as a reflection of himself, and any imperfection had to be beaten out or controlled. Did that control extend to his son's marriage?" Martha's eyes darkened. "When Darius brought Simone home, Reginald was charming. Too charming. He started visiting them all the time, bringing Simone little gifts, complimenting her. At first, I thought maybe he was finally trying to be a good father. But then I saw the way he looked at her when he thought no one was watching. It wasn't the look of a father-in-law. It was the look of a predator." She shuddered. "He did the same thing to Darius's first serious girlfriend in high school. Seduced her, just to prove he could. Just to break his own son's heart. He couldn't stand to see Darius happy with something that he couldn't control or possess. The picture Martha painted was of a deeply disturbed narcissist hiding behind a veneer of piety. It was a classic profile for a manipulator, and it added a sinister new layer to the crime. Meanwhile, Jake Walsh was getting a similar, if less damning, story from Simone's co-workers. They described her as sweet and professional, but in recent months she had become withdrawn and distracted. She was on her phone a lot, always smiling at texts, but she'd hide the screen if you came near, one of the salesgirls told him. She started dressing up more, wearing new jewelry. We all thought she was having an affair. She and Darius. She said he was a good man, but he was always working, always tired. She felt neglected. Another colleague mentioned something more specific. Her father-in-law, Reginald, started picking her up from work sometimes. She said it was just to help out when Darius was busy, but it felt weird. He'd hold her arm a little too long, look at her a little too intently. It gave me the creeps. Back at the precinct, Eli and Walsh compared their notes. The narrative was becoming clearer. A secret affair between a lonely, neglected wife and her manipulative, controlling father-in-law. It was the perfect recipe for a crime of passion. All the evidence was pointing away from a random robbery and squarely at one man. The wronged husband, Darius Hayes. There was just one problem: his alibi. Deacon, Darius's boss and best friend, was adamant. He and Darius had been elbow-deep in a greasy transmission from 5 p.m. until after 9 p.m. on the night of the murders. No way he could have left, Deacon stated firmly. I was with him every second. We were cursing at that damn Chevy together. D is devastated. He loves Simone more than anything. The alibi was a brick wall. Without a way to break it, they had nothing but motive and suspicion, which wouldn't hold up for 5 minutes in court. The case felt like it was stalling before it had even truly begun. Eli felt the familiar churn of frustration in his gut. He knew they were missing something. People lied, especially to protect their friends, but Deacon's story was detailed and unshakable. Feeling restless, Eli decided to take a different approach. Let's pull the traffic cam footage from the main roads around Peachy's, he said to Walsh, and run the plates of every vehicle that passed between 6:30 and 7:30. It was a long shot, a search for a needle in a digital haystack. Hours later, a tech analyst called Eli over to his screen. Detective, you're going to want to see this. On the screen was a grainy but clear image from a red light camera on a boulevard 2 miles from the crime scene. The timestamp read 7:41 p.m. The camera had captured a dusty 20-year-old Toyota pickup truck. It was the same model, same color, and same distinctive dent on the rear fender as the one parked in Darius Hayes' driveway. The driver's face was obscured by shadow, but the truck was unmistakable. It was heading in the direction of Deacon's auto repair, away from Peachy's chicken shack. Eli stared at the screen, a cold sense of certainty washing over him. The brick wall of Darius's alibi had just developed a crack, a big one. Darius Hayes wasn't at the garage the whole night. He had lied, and his best friend was covering for him. The hunt was on. The traffic camera photo was a game changer, but it was still circumstantial. It placed Darius's truck near the scene, but it didn't put a weapon in his hand. The next logical step was to dive into the victims' digital lives. Warrants were issued for Simone's and Reginald's cell phone records, and the tech unit began the painstaking process of data extraction. Eli hoped to find the digital breadcrumbs that would lead them through the secret life the two had been living. The initial results, however, were disappointingly clean. Their main phone showed nothing more than mundane family communication. Texts between Simone and Reginald were sparse and formal. "Can you tell Darius I'll be late?" or "Happy Thanksgiving to you both." Their call logs were equally innocuous. It was a digital dead end, a carefully curated facade of a normal father-in-law and daughter-in-law relationship. "It's too clean," Eli muttered to Walsh as they stared at the printouts. "People having an affair are messy. They slip up. They use their main phones. This is deliberate. They were hiding." Walsh, ever the optimist, suggested they look at financial records. Maybe they were booking hotel rooms, buying gifts. Something has to connect them. For 2 days, they waded through bank statements and credit card bills. They found nothing. No secret hotel stays, no extravagant purchases. It was as if the affair had been conducted entirely in the ether, leaving no trace in the physical or primary digital worlds. The frustration in the homicide bullpen was palpable. The case was growing cold, and the media was starting to run stories about a possible serial killer targeting couples, fueling public fear. Eli, however, couldn't shake the feeling that they were looking in the wrong place. He called in a young, sharp-eyed analyst from the cybercrime unit named Kenji Tanaka. Kenji was a digital native who saw the world in code and data streams. Eli explained the situation: the clean phones, the lack of a financial trail, the feeling that they were missing an entire conversation. Kenji listened intently, tapping his fingers on his desk. "They were disciplined," he said. "That means they were either very smart or very paranoid, or both. Let's look for the infrastructure. How do you maintain a secret line of communication? You buy burner phones." "We thought of that," Walsh interjected, "but there are no records of them buying any." "You don't buy them with a credit card," Kenji countered with a slight smile. "You buy them with cash at a bodega or a 7-Eleven, and you buy prepaid minutes the same way. But even burner phones need to be paid for. Let's check their bank records again, but not for big purchases. Let's look for small, regular cash withdrawals, 20 or 30 bucks, every couple of weeks, from ATMs they don't normally use." It was a brilliant piece of deductive reasoning. They spent the next few hours cross-referencing ATM withdrawal locations and dates from both Simone's and Reginald's accounts. And then they found it: a pattern. Once a month, like clockwork, Simone would withdraw $40 from an ATM in a town 15 miles away. 2 days later, Reginald would withdraw the exact same amount from a different ATM across the city. The pattern had started 6 months ago. It was the thread they needed. Armed with this new information, they got a warrant compelling the cell service providers to triangulate and identify any prepaid, unregistered phones that were activated and topped up in those specific areas on those specific dates. It was a digital dragnet, and after a day of cross-referencing data, they got a hit. 2 burner phone numbers, activated within days of each other, that had almost exclusively contacted each other for the past 6 months. When Kenji finally decrypted and printed the text messages from those phones, he handed the thick stack of paper to Eli with a grim look. "Here's your motive, detective." Eli and Walsh spent the next hour reading through the messages in stunned silence. It was a complete, uncensored chronicle of the affair, from its hesitant beginnings to its passionate, reckless peak. It started innocently enough, with Reginald offering a sympathetic ear to a lonely Simone. "Reginald, he works too hard. A beautiful woman like you shouldn't be eating dinner alone." "Simone, it's just how he is. He loves his work." Quickly the tone shifted. Reginald began to subtly poison Simone against her husband, his own son. "Reginald, he takes you for granted. I never would. He learned his carelessness from his mother, not from me." "Simone, you're sweet to say that. Sometimes I do feel invisible." The manipulation was masterful. He played on her insecurities, her loneliness, positioning himself as the only one who truly saw her, who truly appreciated her. The messages grew more flirtatious, then explicitly sexual. They planned secret meetings at out-of-the-way motels and secluded parks. And then they read the messages from the week of the murders. "Simone, I'm scared, Reggie. Darius has been acting strange, so quiet and watchful. I think he suspects something. Reginald, don't be foolish, my dear. Darius has never been smart enough to see what's right in front of him. He's weak, always has been. Let's meet somewhere public but private. No one will notice us there." "Simone, where?" "Reginald, that chicken place off the highway. Peachy's, in the handicapped restroom. It's large and has a lock. We'll be in and out. Thursday, 7 p.m. I need to see you." Eli put the last page down, his hands clenched. The cold, calculated cruelty of Reginald Hayes was breathtaking. He had not only seduced his son's wife, but had also belittled him, mocked his intelligence, and orchestrated the very meeting that led to their deaths. He had lured Simone to her doom with the same manipulative words he had used to lure her into his bed. The motive was no longer just passion. It was a lifetime of psychological warfare culminating in the ultimate act of betrayal, and now they had the proof they needed to break Darius Hayes' alibi and his story wide open. Armed with the damning text messages and the traffic camera footage, Eli and Walsh knew it was time to confront the 2 people holding up Darius Hayes' story. his best friend, Dion, and Darius himself. They decided to start with the weakest link. They found Dion under the hood of a Ford F-150 at his auto shop, the air thick with the smell of oil and solvent. He wiped his greasy hands on a rag and greeted them with a wary look. "Detectives? Found who did it yet?" "We're getting closer," Eli said, his voice level. "We need to talk about your statement, Dion. The one about Darius being here with you all night on Thursday." Dion's affable demeanor tightened. He crossed his arms over his chest. "I already told you. He was here. We were working on that piece of junk over there." He jerked a thumb toward the old Chevy in the corner. Eli didn't flinch. He simply laid a copy of the traffic camera photo on the tool chest next to Dion. "Then can you explain what his truck was doing on Eisenhower Parkway at 7:41 p.m. that night, heading back this way?" Dion stared at the photo, his eyes wide. He licked his lips, his feigned confidence evaporating. That could be any old Toyota. Lots of them around. "It's got the same dent on the rear fender, Dion," Walsh pressed, his voice sharp. "The same rust spot over the wheel well. It's his truck. We know it, and you know it. Lying to federal officers in a homicide investigation is a felony, obstruction of justice. You could do 5 years for that. Is your loyalty to your friend worth 5 years of your life? Is it worth losing this shop you've worked so hard to build?" The threat hung in the air, heavy and unavoidable. Dion's shoulders slumped in defeat. He ran a hand over his face, smearing grease across his cheek. "Look, he's a good guy," he stammered, his voice cracking. "He's my best friend. When he came back, he was a wreck, not crying, just empty, like his soul had been scooped out." "So he did leave," Eli said softly. It wasn't a question. Dion nodded, avoiding their eyes. "Yeah, he left, around 6:45. Said he needed to go clear his head, handle some personal business. I didn't ask. He came back maybe an hour later, just walked in, picked up a wrench, and went back to work on the transmission like he'd never left. Didn't say a word. And you lied for him." "He's my brother?" Dion whispered, his voice thick with shame. "He begged me. Said he just went for a drive and didn't want the cops thinking he was involved. I believed him." With the alibi shattered, they had a clear timeline. Darius left the shop at 6:45 p.m. The murders happened sometime between 6:30 and 7:30 p.m. His truck was photographed 2 miles from the scene at 7:41 p.m., heading back to the shop. It all fit. But how did he know they would be there? How did he pinpoint that specific time and that specific sordid location? The answer, they suspected, lay in Darius's own phone. With Dion's revised statement, they now had more than enough probable cause for a new warrant. They picked up Darius from his home, telling him they needed him to come to the station to clarify a few things. He came quietly, his face a stony, unreadable mask. The performative grief was gone, replaced by a cold, brittle calm. At the precinct, while Darius sat in an interview room, Kenji Tanaka went to work on his phone. It didn't take long. "Got it," Kenji announced, waving Eli and Walsh over. "It's a nasty little piece of spyware, an app called TrackView. It's disguised as a system utility file. It gives him full access to her phone's GPS in real time, turns on her camera and microphone remotely, everything. He's been watching her for months." Kenji pulled up the location data history from the app. It was a heartbreaking map of Simone's deception and Darius's obsession. They could see her trips to the hidden motels, the secluded parks, and finally, the journey to Peachy's Chicken Shack on the night she died. But there was more. Kenji cross-referenced the app's activity log with the data from Darius's phone. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a series of timestamps. On Thursday, at 6:40 p.m., the app on Darius's phone was opened. He checked Simone's real-time location. He saw she was at Peachy's. 5 minutes later, at 6:45 p.m., his phone's GPS shows him leaving the auto shop. He didn't just stumble upon them. He wasn't just in the area. He knew exactly where she was. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. This wasn't a crime of sudden, explosive passion. It was a calculated act of vengeance. Darius Hayes had watched his wife's betrayal unfold in real time on his phone screen. He saw her go to that restaurant, a place so mundane and public it was the perfect cover. Perhaps he even saw Reginald's car pull into the lot. And then, armed with that knowledge, he had left his job, driven to the scene, and walked into that restroom to confront them. The noose had tightened. They had motive, means, and opportunity. They had a timeline, digital evidence, and a broken alibi. They had everything they needed to prove that Darius Hayes was the killer. Everything except for one crucial, tangible thing, the weapon that had unleashed such brutal fury. Without the knife, a skilled defense attorney could still create reasonable doubt, painting Darius as a grieving husband being framed by circumstantial evidence. They had to find the knife. With a confession seeming unlikely and their circumstantial case strong but not airtight, the hunt for the murder weapon became the investigation's singular focus. Eli knew that the knife was more than just a piece of evidence. It was the physical embodiment of the rage that had exploded in that bathroom. Finding it would be the final, irrefutable link between Darius Hayes and the slaughter. The initial searches had yielded nothing. The forensics team had meticulously combed every inch of the crime scene and the surrounding area. They had sifted through the dumpsters behind Peachy's Chicken Shack and the adjacent businesses, wading through a foul-smelling morass of discarded food, greasy napkins, and cardboard boxes. Nothing. Next, they executed a new, more thorough search warrant on Darius's house and his truck. For an entire day, teams of officers turned the small craftsman house upside down. They checked heating vents, cisterns, and crawl spaces. They dug through trash cans and leaf piles in the backyard. They used magnetic sweeps under the porch. In the garage, amidst the organized chaos of tools and car parts, they found several knives, but all were clean, showing no trace of blood, even under microscopic analysis. His pickup truck was similarly sterile. It was as if Darius Hayes had anticipated their every move, meticulously sanitizing his world of any incriminating evidence. "He's smart," Walsh said, running a frustrated hand through his hair as they stood in Darius's garage. "He didn't panic. He killed them, cleaned up, and made that weapon disappear." "Or he's just a good mechanic," Eli countered, his gaze sweeping over the neatly arranged tools on the pegboard wall. "He knows how things work. He knows how to take things apart and how to hide them. He wouldn't have thrown the knife in a dumpster right behind the restaurant. Too obvious, too risky. He would have taken it with him." Eli pulled out a map of Macon and spread it on the hood of his car. With a red marker, he traced the most direct route from Peachy's Chicken Shack back to Dion's auto repair. It was a 4-mile stretch of road that cut through a mix of commercial strips, residential neighborhoods, and a few patches of undeveloped green space. "He drove this route," Eli said, tapping the red line. "He was jacked up on adrenaline and rage. He needed to get rid of the knife before he got back to the shop, before he saw Deacon. He would have looked for a place to dump it, somewhere quick and convenient, but not somewhere it could be easily found." They spent the next 2 days driving that route, over and over. They organized search teams to walk the roadside, peering into storm drains, culverts, and thickets of bushes. They sent divers into a small retention pond near an overpass. The search was grueling, monotonous, and ultimately fruitless. The weapon remained invisible, a ghost that haunted their investigation. The pressure was mounting. The district attorney was getting impatient, wanting to move forward with the circumstantial case. But Eli was adamant. He knew a jury could be swayed by a charismatic defense lawyer who could poke holes in a story built on cell phone data and grainy photos. They needed something tangible. They needed the knife. One evening, sitting in his car and staring at the map, Eli felt a familiar sense of being stuck. He closed his eyes and tried to put himself in Darius's shoes on that night. You've just committed an act of unspeakable violence. Your hands are shaking. Your heart is pounding. You're driving, but you're barely seeing the road. You're looking for a place, not just any place, a place of finality, a place where things go to be forgotten. His eyes snapped open. He looked at the map again, his finger tracing the red line. Halfway between the restaurant and the auto shop, the route ran alongside an old, semi-neglected city park. Oakwood Park. It was a small stretch of land with a rundown playground, a few picnic tables, and a small creek that snaked through its center before disappearing into a concrete culvert. It was the kind of place people cut through but rarely stopped at. It was dark, overgrown in places, and offered a dozen spots to discard something unseen. "It's there," Eli whispered to himself. He pulled over and threw it in the park. The next morning, he pitched his theory to Walsh and their captain. "It's a long shot, Eli," the captain said, skeptical. "We could spend a week searching that park and find nothing but old beer cans and used condoms." "Maybe," Eli conceded, "but my gut tells me it's there, and I think I know how we can find it without spending a week. It's time we brought in a different kind of detective, one with a better nose than any of us." Walsh looked at him, confused. "Get Officer O'Malley and Max on the phone," Eli said, a renewed sense of purpose in his voice. "We're going canine." Officer Dave O'Malley was a man who seemed to share a single mind with his partner. He was lean and wiry, with a quiet intensity that commanded respect. His partner, Max, was a magnificent German shepherd, a 90-pound powerhouse of muscle and intelligence, whose dedication to his job was absolute. Max was a dual-purpose K9, trained in apprehension and narcotics, but his specialty, and O'Malley's pride, was evidence recovery. He was a cadaver dog, a drug dog, and a gun dog all rolled into one. His nose could detect the faintest trace of human decomposition, gunpowder residue, and, most importantly for this case, the smell of human blood on metal, even after it had been exposed to the elements. They met Eli and Walsh at the entrance to Oakwood Park early the next morning. The air was still cool, and dew clung to the overgrown grass. Eli explained his theory, that a desperate Darius Hayes, fleeing the scene, had pulled over and flung the murder weapon into the park's dense foliage. O'Malley listened, nodding slowly. "It's a large area, Detective. What are we looking for, specifically?" "A knife," Eli said. "Most likely a hunting knife or a large utility blade. It could be anywhere." "That's all Max needs to know," O'Malley replied. He turned to his partner, who was sitting patiently by his side, his ears perked, his intelligent eyes fixed on his handler. O'Malley gave a series of quiet commands in German, the language he used for all of Max's work. He presented Max with a sterile piece of gauze that had been lightly touched to a sample of blood from the crime scene, allowing the dog to lock onto the scent. Then he gave the final command. "Such," the German word for seek. With a low whine of excitement, Max was off. He worked in a grid pattern, his nose to the ground, his tail held low and straight, indicating he was in search mode. O'Malley followed a few paces behind, holding the long leash, allowing Max the freedom to follow the scent wherever it might lead. Eli and Walsh hung back, watching in silence. To see Max work was to witness an almost supernatural ability. The dog ignored the tantalizing smells of squirrels and discarded food, his entire being focused on a single, invisible task. For the first hour, they found nothing. Max led them through the playground, around the picnic area, and along the edge of the parking lot. He would occasionally show interest, his tail giving a slight flutter, but then he would move on, having dismissed the scent as old or irrelevant. The morning sun began to climb higher, and the Georgia humidity started to settle in. Eli felt a familiar pang of doubt. Maybe his gut had been wrong this time. They moved toward the back of the park, where the manicured lawn gave way to a wilder, more overgrown area bordering the small, murky creek. Here, the undergrowth was thick with kudzu vines and thorny bushes. It was a perfect place to hide something. Suddenly, Max's entire demeanor changed. He stopped, his head held high, his nose twitching as he tested the air. He let out a single, sharp bark. "He's got something!" O'Malley said, his voice low and tense. Max lowered his head again and began to move with a new urgency, pulling O'Malley forward. He plunged into a thick patch of kudzu near the creek bank, disappearing from view. They could hear him crashing through the vines, whining with a focused intensity. A moment later, another series of frantic barks echoed from the thicket. O'Malley, Eli, and Walsh pushed their way through the tangled vines, which grabbed at their clothes like grasping hands. They found Max digging furiously at the base of a large oak tree, the earth flying out from behind his powerful legs. His barks were now continuous, a clear, unmistakable alert. "Aus!" O'Malley commanded, telling the dog to back off. Max immediately stopped digging and sat, his chest heaving, his eyes locked on the spot he had just unearthed. O'Malley knelt down, pulling on a pair of gloves. He carefully brushed away the loose dirt and decaying leaves. At first, there was nothing but dark, damp earth. But then, his fingers touched something hard and cold, Slowly, carefully, he worked it free from the soil. He stood up and turned to Eli and Walsh, holding the object in his gloved hand. It was a knife, a large hunting knife with a wooden handle, its blade caked in mud and rust spots. But even through the grime, they could see the dark, telltale stains of old blood. They had found it, the invisible weapon, the physical link, the final nail in Darius Hayes' coffin. Max sat patiently, looking up at his handler, and when O'Malley gave him a soft, "good boy," the dog's tail thumped against the ground, his work for the day complete. As Eli looked at the weapon that had been used to butcher two people, he felt not a sense of triumph, but a profound sadness. Justice was a grim, dirty business, often unearthed from the mud by the nose of a good dog. The discovery of the knife sent a jolt of electricity through the investigation. It was immediately bagged, tagged, and rushed to the state crime lab. While they waited for the forensic analysis, the knife itself was carefully cleaned in a controlled environment. As the layers of mud and grime were painstakingly removed, a detail emerged that was far more chilling than any DNA result could ever be. It was an inscription, expertly burned into the wooden handle. The lettering was slightly faded from its time in the earth, but it was still perfectly legible. It read, "To Darius, from Dad. Always be a strong man." Eli Ford stared at the photograph of the inscription, a cold dread washing over him. This wasn't just any knife. This was a gift, a token of fatherly advice from the very man it was likely used to kill. The irony was so thick, so grotesque, it was almost poetic. Reginald Hayes, the master manipulator, had armed his own executioner years ago, embedding a command, "Be a strong man," that his son had finally, tragically, obeyed in the most horrific way possible. The knife was no longer just a murder weapon. It was a symbol of a lifetime of twisted psychology, a totem of a toxic relationship that had ended in blood. 2 days later, the lab results came back, confirming what they already knew in their hearts. The DNA from the blood found on the blade was a match for both Simone and Reginald Hayes, and deep within the grain of the wooden handle, protected from the elements, forensics found a partial fingerprint. It was a perfect match for Darius Hayes' right thumb. It was over. The circumstantial case was now a fortress, buttressed by incontrovertible physical evidence. They had him, and there was no way out. Eli and Walsh walked down the sterile hallway to the interrogation room, where Darius had been held since his arrest. He had refused to speak, requesting a lawyer, and had been sitting in silence for the past 48 hours. The public defender assigned to him was a young, earnest man who looked completely out of his depth. When they entered the room, Darius looked up, his face gaunt and expressionless. The cold calm was still there, but his eyes were hollow, haunted. "Darius," Eli began, his voice quiet and even. He didn't come in hot. He knew aggression wouldn't work on this man. Darius had been living with a bully his whole life. He knew how to weather a storm of anger. Eli decided on a different approach. He would simply lay out the truth, piece by painful piece. He started by placing the traffic camera photo on the metal table between them. Then came Deion's revised statement. Then the printouts of the text messages from the burner phones, their sordid contents exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights. Through it all, Darius remained silent, his gaze fixed on a spot on the wall behind Eli's head. His lawyer shifted uncomfortably, whispering for him not to say a word. "We know you were tracking her, Darius," Eli continued, sliding the report on the spyware across the table. "We know you saw she was at Peachy's. We know you left work and went there. We know you lied to us. We know your alibi is a fabrication." Still, nothing. Darius sat like a statue, a man encased in a shell of denial or shock. Walsh was getting visibly agitated, ready to start yelling, but Eli shot him a look that told him to stand down. Finally, Eli took out the last piece of evidence. It was a large, clear evidence bag. Inside, cleaned and gleaming under the lights, was the hunting knife. He placed it directly in front of Darius, the inscription on the handle facing him. "To Darius, from Dad. Always be a strong man." The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The moment Darius's eyes fell upon the knife, his entire body seemed to collapse inward. The stony facade shattered like glass. A deep, ragged tremor ran through him, starting in his shoulders and shaking his entire frame. His jaw clenched, and his eyes, for the first time, filled with tears. He stared at the knife, at the words his father had carved for him, and a low, animalistic sound of pure agony escaped his throat. His lawyer put a hand on his arm. "Darius, don't." But it was too late. The dam had broken. "He gave that to me for my 18th birthday," Darius whispered, his voice hoarse and broken. He said it was for protection, to be a man." He looked up at Eli, his eyes pleading, searching for an understanding that he knew he wouldn't find. "He never wanted me to be a strong man. He wanted me to be his man, an extension of him. And when I wouldn't be, he decided to take everything that was mine." The confession began to pour out of him, not in a rush, but in a slow, torturous flood of pain and memory. The cold steel of the knife on the table hadn't just proven a murder, it had unlocked a lifetime of silent suffering. The sterile, windowless interrogation room seemed to shrink as Darius Hayes began to speak. The air grew heavy, thick with the weight of a story that had been suppressed for years, a narrative of quiet torment that had finally found its voice in the aftermath of horrific violence. His court-appointed lawyer sat beside him, nervously jotting notes. But this was no longer a legal proceeding. It was a purge, a desperate unburdening of a soul that had carried too much for too long. "I started to suspect something a few months ago," Darius began, his voice barely a whisper. He didn't look at Eli or Walsh, but at the knife in the evidence bag, as if it were a dark oracle. "Simone, she changed. She became distant, always on her phone, smiling at things she wouldn't show me. She started staying late at work, or so she said. She bought new clothes, new perfume, little things, but they add up." He took a shaky breath. "And my father?" He started coming around more. He'd never been interested in my life, in my work. He always called it grease monkey business. But suddenly, he was at our house every week, bringing gifts for Simone, telling her she was too good for this little house, too good for me. He'd put his hand on her back and let it linger. He did it right in front of me, smiling, daring me to say something. He knew I wouldn't. I never did. The rage in the bathroom hadn't been born in a moment, Eli realized. It had been simmering for a lifetime, stoked by 1,000 small humiliations, 1,000 acts of psychological warfare. "I installed the app," Darius admitted, a flicker of shame in his eyes. "I know it was wrong, but I had to know if I was going crazy. I had to know if what I was seeing was real. And it was. I watched her go to motels on the other side of town. I saw her at parks I'd never been to with her. It was all there, in red lines on a map on my phone." He paused, swallowing hard. "That day, I was at work. I tried not to look. I swear I did. But it was like a compulsion. I opened the app, and I saw she was at Peachy's. I thought, it's just lunch. It's fine. But then, I remembered. That's near the church where he's a deacon. I got this sick feeling in my stomach. I told Dion I had to go. As I pulled into the lot, I saw his car, his black Cadillac, parked right next to her Honda, and I knew." His voice broke. He described walking into the restaurant in a daze, his mind a fog of denial and white-hot rage. He didn't see them in the dining area. He checked the main restrooms. Empty. Then he heard it. A muffled laugh coming from the handicapped restroom at the end of the hall. He knew her laugh, and then he heard his father's low chuckle. "I had the knife with me," he said, his eyes finally meeting Eli's. "The one he gave me, I always kept it in my truck's glove box, for work, for cutting hoses, whatever. I don't even remember grabbing it. It was just in my hand. I walked to the door. I didn't even knock. I just opened it." He squeezed his eyes shut, as if trying to block out the memory. "What I saw, she was against the wall, and he was a monster. They didn't even see me at first. When they did my father, he just smiled, like he'd won, like this was his final victory. He said something like, 'See, boy, I told you, a real man takes what he wants.'" The room was utterly silent, save for the hum of the ventilation system. "I don't remember the next few minutes clearly," Darius continued, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "It was like watching a movie of someone else's life. There was screaming, a lot of screaming, and blood. I remember the feeling of the knife in my hand. It felt heavy. And then it was over. They were on the floor, and it was quiet. He looked down at his own hands, turning them over as if seeing them for the first time. I killed him first. He tried to fight me, but he was old, weaker than he thought. And then... Simone. She was screaming, begging me to stop, but all I could see was his face, his smile. All I could see was the betrayal. From both of them. He fell silent, the confession complete. He had laid the entire ugly story out on the table. He didn't make excuses or ask for pity. He simply stated what had happened, his voice a monotone of profound exhaustion. The storm had passed, leaving nothing but wreckage behind. Eli let the silence hang in the air for a long moment before he spoke. "And the knife?" "I drove," Darius said. "I don't know where I was going. I just drove. I saw the park. It was dark. I pulled over, ran in, and just threw it, as hard as I could into the dark. I wanted it gone. I wanted him gone." The confession, elicited not by force but by the cold, hard truth of a single object, was recorded. The case was closed. As they led Darius Hayes away in handcuffs, he looked not like a monster, but like a man who had finally been broken by one. Darius Hayes' formal confession was more than a recitation of events. It was an autopsy of a family, a deep dive into the slow-acting poison of psychological abuse that had flowed through the Hayes bloodline for a generation. In the days that followed, through a series of interviews with a court-appointed psychologist, the full harrowing scope of Reginald Hayes' cruelty was laid bare, painting a portrait not of a victim, but of a lifelong tormentor who had finally reaped what he had sown. The story was told in a series of fragmented, painful flashbacks, memories that Darius had tried to bury, but that had shaped his every action. He remembered being 8 years old, proudly showing his father a school project that had earned him a B+. Reginald had looked at the grade, his face hardening. He hadn't yelled. Yelling was too simple. Instead, he had calmly told Darius to go outside. "A B+ means you only gave 85% effort," Reginald had said, his voice cold as ice. "So you will run laps around this house until you understand what 100% feels like." Darius ran until he threw up from exhaustion and collapsed in the backyard, his father watching from the kitchen window, unmoved. He remembered being 16, falling in love for the first time with a girl named Maria. He was shy, awkward, but she had seen something kind in him. He brought her home to meet his parents. Reginald had turned on the charm, making her laugh, telling her stories, making Darius feel like a clumsy child in his father's presence. A week later, Maria broke up with him, refusing to give a reason. 2 months later, Darius saw his father's Cadillac parked outside her house late at night. When he confronted Reginald, his father had simply smiled that same winning smile. "She was a woman, son, and you were just a boy. Consider it a lesson." It was the first time Darius felt a murderous rage, a feeling he quickly suppressed, ashamed of his own dark thoughts. This was Reginald's pattern, a systematic dismantling of his son's confidence and happiness. He didn't use his fists. His weapons were far more insidious. He used manipulation, public humiliation, and emotional sabotage. When Darius chose to become a mechanic, a profession that allowed him to build and fix things with his own hands, Reginald saw it as a personal affront. It was something he couldn't control, a world he didn't understand. "My son," he would say at church gatherings with a sigh, "he's good with his hands, a simple man for simple work." Meeting and marrying Simone was Darius's one true act of rebellion. She was his escape, his proof that he could build a life outside of his father's suffocating shadow. For a few years, they were happy. They kept their distance from Reginald, and for a while, it seemed like Darius had finally broken free. But a predator, Darius explained to the psychologist, is patient. Reginald re-entered their lives under the guise of reconciliation, feigning a desire to be a better father, a doting grandfather-to-be, but it was all a lie. He saw in Simone not a daughter, but a final frontier for his conquest, the ultimate way to prove his dominance over his son. The text messages on the burner phone corroborated Darius's story with chilling precision. They showed how Reginald had methodically groomed Simone, exploiting her loneliness and insecurities. Reginald: "Darius doesn't understand a woman's needs. He's too busy with his cars. A man should worship his wife. I would worship you." He poisoned her against Darius, preying on her fears, convincing her that her quiet, hard-working husband was secretly just like him, a cold, unfeeling man. He presented himself as her savior, the only one who could offer her the passion and attention she deserved. Simone, I feel so guilty. He's a good man. Reginald, he is my son. I know him. That quietness is not kindness. It is weakness. It is rage turned inward. One day it will turn on you. I would never let anything harm you. He was a master of psychological projection, accusing his own son of the very darkness that resided within himself. He had convinced Simone that she was in danger from Darius, and that the only safe place was in his arms. It was a twisted, diabolical seduction, and it had worked. What happened in the bathroom at Peachy's Chicken Shack was not a sudden snap. It was the eruption of a volcano that had been building pressure for 30 years. When Darius saw his father with his wife, and saw that triumphant, mocking smile, he wasn't just seeing an act of infidelity. He was seeing the culmination of every belittling comment, every stolen joy, every calculated cruelty he had ever endured. He was seeing the monster who had haunted his entire existence. And in that moment, the command burned into the handle of the knife, always be a strong man, took on a new, horrifying meaning. He finally stood up to his father. He finally used the strength Reginald had always demanded of him, but he used it to destroy his creator. It was a final, tragic act of a man who had been pushed far beyond the limits of human endurance. The trial of Darius Hayes was a somber, swift affair. Faced with an ironclad case, the confession, the forensic evidence, the testimony of Deacon and Martha Hayes, Darius's public defender advised him to take a plea deal. The prosecution, acknowledging the extreme psychological duress and the history of abuse, agreed to take the death penalty off the table. Darius Hayes pleaded guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder and was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms in prison with no possibility of parole. He accepted his fate with the same quiet resignation he had shown since his confession, a man already serving a life sentence in his own mind long before a judge made it official. Weeks later, on a cool autumn evening, Detective Eli Ford stood on his front porch, looking out at the setting sun. His retirement was just a few days away. The paperwork for the Hayes case was filed, the evidence locked away. But the story and the people in it lingered in his thoughts. A car pulled up to the curb, and Jake Walsh got out. He had a 6-pack of beer in his hand. "Figured you wouldn't want to drink alone on one of your last nights as a free man," he said with a small smile. Eli nodded, gesturing for him to take a seat on the porch swing. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the crickets start their nightly chorus. "You know," Jake said finally, breaking the quiet, "when we first rolled up to that scene, I thought what that uniform thought. Drug deal, robbery, another statistic." He shook his head, looking down at his beer bottle. "I saw 2 black victims, and my mind went to the easiest, ugliest stereotype. I was wrong. I was lazy. We all carry those shortcuts in our heads, Jake," Eli said, his voice gentle. "The job is to know they're there and to choose to look past them every single time. You did. That's what matters." "This case," Jake trailed off, "it wasn't about race or drugs or money. It was like something out of a Greek tragedy." "Worse," Eli corrected him. "It was a family tragedy. The kind that happens every day in quiet houses on quiet streets. Not always with a knife, sometimes just with words, with silence, with control." He took a long sip of his beer. Reginald Hayes was a murderer long before Darius ever picked up that knife. He murdered his son's spirit, slowly, piece by piece, over 30 years. He just never expected the ghost to come back and kill him. They sat there as darkness fell completely, the streetlights humming to life. The case had served as a stark, brutal reminder of a lesson Eli had learned long ago. The most terrifying monsters aren't the strangers lurking in the shadows or the villains on the nightly news. They are often the ones who share our name, who sit at our dinner table, who hide their cruelty behind a mask of love and piety. The story of the Hayes family was a dark and twisted fable for the modern age. It served as a chilling warning that the cycle of violence, especially the quiet, unseen violence of the mind and spirit, never truly ends. It only transforms. It demonstrated how a victim, pushed to the absolute edge of his sanity, could become a perpetrator, his final, desperate act of self-preservation, indistinguishable from an act of monstrous revenge. As Eli looked out into the quiet neighborhood, he knew that behind those closed doors, under the warm glow of porch lights, other silent battles were being fought. The legacy of the Hayes case wasn't just about bringing one killer to justice. It was about understanding that true justice requires us to look beyond the bloody crime scene, beyond our easiest assumptions, and into the dark, complicated heart of the human family, where the deepest wounds are often inflicted long before any blood is ever shed.